Let all bitterness and wrath and anger and clamor and railing be put away from you with all malice, and be kind one to another, tender-hearted, forgiving each other, even as God also in Christ forgave you.
Fear is the path to the dark side. Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
Hello and welcome to Libations and Lectionaries. I'm Reverend Jimmy Gaughan. For this episode, I'm joined for the first time in a while by my wife, the Reverend Caitie Smith, and two of our friends, Jacob Parris and Molly Miller, who are the first two legitimate lay people we have had on the show. Everybody else prior to you guys has had formal theological education and is a minister and so on. And, it'll be nice to get the perspective of somebody who doesn't have their head up their own butt theologically all the time. So, welcome to the show, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I don't know that they know how to feel about that.
We will try to bring it up to y'all standards at least.
No. At your own level.
Yeah.
Oh,
No.
That's the whole point of having you here, to get the perspective of somebody who isn't lost in the haze of theology 99% of the time.
that's fair.
Yep.
Not to say that my prior guests have been. I love each and every one of you. So,
How many viewers did you lose?
So, who are you guys? Jacob, what's your relationship to the church, and what do you do in real life?
Well, in real life, I do photography. I do more media-based work. God knows I analyze movies like it's nobody's business. I have a normal desk job. But as far as my relationship with the church, I was born and raised Quaker at a friend's church in Asheboro, Back Creek, actually. And then spent a few years at First United Methodist Church in high school. And then after that, took an extended break. Then spent some time working for a non-denominational church as a sound tech. And after I left there, just kind of have wandered about, as it were, and have recently started dabbling in paganism, of all things.
All right. Well, it's spirituality, right?
Correct. I have always been spiritual on some level.
Yeah. I think you'd find the same is true of a lot of people of our generation who grew up in the church and ended up being disaffected in one way or another. Return to it not through the religious route, but through the spiritual route. It's where the whole spiritual but not religious thing comes from, which seems pretty reasonable given how badly the church screwed up in the 90s.
It's fair.
Molly, how about you? What do you do, and what's your relationship to the church?
So I work for the Girl Scouts. I work for the local council here in North Carolina. I am a recruitment manager, so I recruit new girl and adult members, and I very much have a passion for it and what I do. My relationship with the church is I grew up, my father's side of the family was Catholic. He's one of 7 children. And my mother's side of the family is Episcopal. So basically I was Catholic and Catholic light. And then did that all the way through, went through catechism classes and confirmation classes, whole 9 yards, both sides, got to keep everybody happy. Until I went to college. When I went to college, I actually went to a Methodist college. So got a whole new experience there. I actually do have a religion minor.
Okay.
So in college, I went through all the Old Testament, New Testament, took Greek and Hebrew. Oh, well, Alexa wants to chime in over here.
Be quiet, Alexa.
I'm reminding you, wind the clock.
She's reminding us, wind the clock.
Excellent.
So anyways, and since then, I attended the Methodist church for a little while, but have kind of never really found my place in what I would call really organized religion. So I do consider myself a spiritual person, very much like you were talking about. But I love to study. So the study of not just the Christian faith, but any faith is very fascinating to me. But not necessarily the everyday practice on Sunday.
Sure. Well, and I don't know if you're familiar with the Pew Forum study that came out a few years ago about religious life in America, but it identified that 1 in 3 millennials who responded said that they were a religious none. They had no particular religious affiliation. And within that, excuse me, within that there was a lot of diversity. There were people who still in their personal lives would practice facets of the Christian faith, the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, or any other number of faiths. And there were also agnostic and atheist folks. But, you know, of the 1 in 3, a significant number of them still said, I am a spiritual person. I'm just not a religious person, which the church doesn't seem to get it. And that will be its demise and downfall. Yay, go church.
Well, and there was a recent study, I think it was based out of Europe, though, about the fact that people who did not affiliate with organized religion were actually perhaps more religious than the actual people who claim organized religion. Like in actual practice, like the way they organize their lives and view their spirituality, they are actually more faithful to whatever it is that they believe than the people who actually sit in pews.
And that makes sense if you think about it, because like somebody who goes to church every Sunday might say, I'm a good Bapto-Metha-Presby-Lutheran, therefore I must be religious. Whereas somebody who doesn't go to church every Sunday is like, I actually need to work at this to satisfy my own needs.
I could agree with that. During my, I'm not sure what the right phrase would be, but walk in the wilderness? Whatever.
Sure, we'll go with that.
Sure.
Let's just say we're all walking in and out of it at all times.
John the Baptist walked in the wilderness, so you're in good company.
I definitely feel like I am sometimes.
And that's fair. During that time, I still did make an effort to pray regularly when I was in situations where I was upset, worried, stressed, whatever. I did commonly find myself praying, and of all things, even though I was not raised Catholic or anything close to it, I would pray the rosary there for a little while to help me, and I found comfort in that. But at the time, you wouldn't have called me dead in a church.
Sure.
For various reasons.
And, you know, you mentioned that, and I think we'll speak to that quite a bit later on, the whole idea of ritual and liturgy being a source of comfort. One of my mentors, Reverend John Myers, he's the Eastern Association Minister for the Southern Conference of the United Church of Christ, and a retired Navy commander. He is as liberal Protestant as they come, but he prays the rosary regularly. It has become a ritual for him that helps him in his personal spiritual walk. Now, he also does Tai Chi and all sorts of different meditative practices. He's a very, very spiritual guy. Good guy, too. He actually, I was part of there's a group of young clergy called the Bethany Fellows, and at my last retreat, when, we take all the people who are leaving and they say goodbye and their mentors give them a blessing, he actually gave me his old lieutenant commander rank for when I get promoted a few years from now.
Wow.
Which was really cool.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of the background. And now, Jacob and Caitie, you guys have known each other for a long time.
Correct.
Yeah.
How long have we known each other now?
Since I was 18.
And I was 15, so almost 15 years.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's half your life, Caitie.
Yeah, half my life.
My goodness gracious.
But that's starting to make me feel old that I can say things like that. That's crazy.
It's I have a couple of friends that I can easily say that friendship has lasted 20 years.
Yeah.
And, man, this house is all sorts of noisy. I apologize.
That's okay. I don't know how much of that clock will actually get picked up by the microphones. And you know what? If it does, it's atmosphere, right?
That's fair. If it has not been figured out yet, my house makes a lot of noise.
Usually I have to contend with dog nails clacking on a hardwood floor and a collar jingling.
That's fair.
So,
but actually, in reference back to how long me and Caitie have known each other, the First United Methodist Church that I attended was through her.
Sure.
Was heavily involved in the youth ministry, and actually, some of the people that I learned from at that time, and I couldn't remember their names to save my life.
Cheryl Skinner and Rebecca Newton, or
Yes.
she was Newton at that time. Rebecca Ramsey now.
Oh,
Yep.
I didn't know she got married.
Yep.
Both of them were very important in kind of opening my eyes, I guess you could say, to the greater circle of spirituality and things of that nature, and helped me become more comfortable in the questioning I was going through at the time of that nature.
Well, and that's something a lot of teenagers need and a lot of teenagers don't get. So it's good that they were able to be there and provide that for you.
Yeah, and they were, I still consider myself extremely lucky that I had both of those people, because they were a rarity. I mean, they still are, like, to have people who were as open as they were and had the kind of conversations they did with us at that age. They were not interested in teaching us how to just sort of passively swallow scripture and just blatantly believe it. They were really challenging us to read it with open eyes and bring all of our questions to the table. And I really don't know that I'd be ordained without either of them. They both know that. So if they ever hear this, that shouldn't be a surprise. They both know that.
And was one of them the one that preached your ordination sermon?
Cheryl.
That's what I thought.
Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Lo, these nearly 3 years ago now.
Yep.
I didn't know Cheryl as well. Rebecca was more the one that I knew. Yeah. Was more the one that I knew during all that time. I think she was there longer.
Yeah,
But
she
there's
overlapped.
But there's a couple of lessons that I learned during that still stick with me today. So
Shout out to you, Rebecca. I'll tag you on Facebook when we post this.
Then, of course, I've only known you guys for a little over a year. It's Memorial Day weekend of last year. Your friend Kristen got married to her husband Aaron, who is a Marine, and so they were like, we could have Jimmy and Caitie co-officiate since he's a Navy chaplain and she's a minister, and we drove down to a really oddly beautiful part of Alabama.
I still thought I was going to get stabbed.
You know what? When we were driving out to that place on the back roads, I was like, I swear to God, I hear banjos right now.
I said the same thing to her.
Yep, as you hit those country roads and saw the signs about the state highways, except it was gravel you were driving over.
Yeah. Of course, I say I hear banjos in some parts of North Carolina, too. There are some parts of Arizona I would probably say that about as well, so, you know.
And actually, that would have been the same weekend that you both met Molly.
Yeah.
She was new girlfriend at the time, and I brought her to... I pretty much thrust her into, here's all these people that are important in my life.
Right.
Have fun. But we
You
all
did just fine, Molly.
Survived.
I mean, isn't that
We didn't
what weddings
eat you.
are for?
Apparently.
Because if you think about it, all the focus is going to be on somebody else all weekend. So even though it's a stressful situation, it is probably lower stress than another such situation might be.
Absolutely.
Like, you don't want people to meet your girlfriend for the first time at, say, a funeral. That would be really awkward.
That would be weird, and that would actually possibly... would that be an original rom-com idea, or has somebody done that?
It's probably happened.
I think it was 4 Deaths and a Funeral.
Four
Was that...
weddings.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Which,
It's
wasn't that
been
Richard
done.
Linklater? Same guy who did Love Actually?
Yeah.
I think so.
Yep.
But she still hasn't seen.
I haven't.
I tell you what, watch it first and then go read the Jezebel.com takedown of Love Actually. It is effing hilarious.
Okay.
Jimmy,
I'm going to have to read that.
I refused to read it for a few years because I didn't want Love Actually to be ruined. I was really concerned. My feminism is very important to me, but there's just some things, can I just enjoy them without overanalyzing them?
Like
I
Hugh
just
Grant
need a few
objectifying
things.
his secretary and then dancing in a stairwell. You know.
Yep.
Okay.
That's part of that movie.
Yeah, it totally is.
Well, I think we've had a long enough tangent because none of that personal stuff's going to be interesting to anybody.
You don't know.
Says you.
So anyway, so on to the libation part of the night. So tonight we are drinking Tank 7 Farmhouse Ale from the Boulevard Brewing Company in Kansas City, Missouri. This is my favorite product that they make. And I didn't drink it for the first time until we were living in Kansas City. When we were there for 2.5 years. Well, I was there for 2.5 years. You were there for a little over 2. Mm-hmm. And it quickly became a particular favorite beer of mine. Interestingly, the first time I had one of their beers, it was their unfiltered wheat beer, and it was at Crankey's in downtown Winston-Salem. It was right before Christmas of 2011. I had gone over there to write a paper, and I was like, well, this paper's going to require liquid inspiration. So I went to see what they had on tap, and they had Boulevard Wheat on tap. So I got that. I wasn't real impressed with it at the time, but then I grew to like it a lot. So, but this is part of what they call their smokestack series. Their brewery in downtown Kansas City has a very distinctive smokestack that you can see from much of the surrounding area. And all of their special beers are part of the smokestack series. So it's good stuff, and it pairs well with barbecue because Kansas City does barbecue.
We were discussing that before the recording was
yes.
What it would go well with.
Yes, indeed. Caitie, do you have anything to add about Tank 7 or Boulevard?
I really don't. I don't have the interest and ability to describe beers the way you do. I just enjoy beer because I enjoy beer.
Well, I think to a certain extent we should all just enjoy beer because we enjoy beer.
I mean, do you want to actually tell people why you like it so much, like, rather than just talking about the first time you had it?
Because it's delicious. I'm not kidding. I mean, this is a great beer. It's very smooth. It drinks well. It's a little strong, 8.5% ABV, so you don't want to play with it. But you know, it's a good beer. And Boulevard was actually purchased by Duvel Mortgart out of the Netherlands a few years ago, along with Firestone Walker in California and Brewery Ommegang in New York. And so with that distribution network, I can get some of my favorite Kansas City and California beers in Burlington at Harris Teeter, which is amazing. It's right there next to the Red Oak and the New Belgium and Sierra Nevada stuff that's made in Asheville, which I find to be outstanding, personally.
It is a good beer.
Your mileage may vary.
I've personally always leaned towards darker beer, and this is right up my alley.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure if Harris Teeter in Burlington sells it, surely Harris Teeter in Winston-Salem must sell it. But, I remember the first time I saw it in there, I was pleasantly surprised. Anyway, we could also talk about the scotch that we drank before the episode.
It was... You pronounced it better than I did.
Balvenie,
Caribbean Cask 14 year.
Yeah.
It is a scotch that I've enjoyed for multiple years. A friend of mine, introduced me to it, brought me the first bottle I had, and it's kind of been the one that I always have on hand. I have your normal scotches and liquors, but that's the one that I'm like, if I'm going to drink it, it's going to be for the right reasons and so whatnot. But it's very smooth, I've always enjoyed it.
Sure. Yeah, it sounds like me with Maker's 46. I like to have it on hand. I'm not going to drink it a lot because it's more pricey than regular Maker's Mark, but...
Right. Or my Pinckney Bend gin.
Yes, her Pinckney Bend gin that you can only get in Missouri and Illinois.
It's very specific.
Via the internet. Well, it's a craft distillery in New Haven, Missouri, right on the Pinckney Bend of the Missouri River.
Okay.
And I think that was actually our first episode, was when we talked about that. Because we had gin and tonics made with that, and we talked about Jesus turning water into wine. Speaking of Jesus, let's talk about Paul.
I have so many problems with the statement you just made. Speaking of Jesus, let's talk about Paul.
It was intended to be an ironic statement.
That's loaded. You just made some people angry with that.
I think anybody who knows me knows that I'm going to take the words of Christ over the words of Paul any day of the week and twice on Sunday. Possibly 3 times, depending on how many services there are.
For those of us without even a religious minor, I just got a little confused by that.
Okay, so Paul wrote Paul did not write half the New Testament. Half of the New Testament is attributed to Paul. More likely, he wrote 3 or 4 of the books, and the rest of what's attributed to him was written by students and disciples of his. And sometimes the teachings of Paul do not necessarily line up with the teachings of Jesus. Like the part where he says women need to shut up and look pretty. Whereas with Jesus, the first person who preached the good news of his resurrection was a woman. Paul was also a lawyer and a Pharisee and very legalistic. So sometimes you kind of have to interpret Paul through that lens. And sometimes people are more willing to lean on Paul than they are on Jesus. Like certain persons who stand up at press conferences and say, Romans 13 says that you need to submit to the law, and then forgets about the part later in Romans 13 where it says everything must be done in love or it is worthless.
Paul, I mean, Jesus' words get misused frequently, as we all know, but Paul is just abhorrently misused and glorified in a way that is just, for me, disgusting, because I've never been able to get down with Paul.
Paul's teachings were used to justify slavery for centuries. So,
Paul is favorited by certain political parties and facets of the church that are more to the...
Not left?
Yes, we'll go with that.
Not left.
So the funny thing is, Paul was probably the author of 1 Corinthians, which has in it such chestnuts as the entire love passage that gets used over and over again at weddings, but which in and of itself, taking away the cliche of it, is a great passage, basically saying, if you don't have love, then nothing you do means anything. So Paul wrote some good stuff, but Paul gets bandied about in a very abusive fashion when it comes to scriptural misinterpretation.
And the different temperatures or degrees of Paul makes for that argument that we don't think he wrote it all.
Right.
That it was some of it is his original words and some of it was students or non-original texts.
Okay.
And for that reason, you could almost feel bad for the dude, because I don't think he ever intended for these letters to be read outside of the community to which they were directed.
Right.
So they're misused and taken far too literally. Even though there's a lot of wisdom in them, I don't deny the wisdom that's there if you're willing to really dig deep and really sift through it. But
well, we can thank St. Jerome and his missal letter for that. Assembling the canon of the New Testament, the 27, I think it was 27 books of the New Testament plus the Septuagint is what they formed the early canon from. And then, the Apocrypha got deleted later on because that wasn't convenient for the Protestant mindset. Orthodox and Catholic are still down with the Apocrypha, so I don't know what our problem is. There's some good stuff in there, too. But, there's a lot of different writings that have been discovered that could just as easily have ended up in the New Testament because they were written by contemporaries of the time in which some of Paul's epistles were written, people like Clement and Origen, and it's like, so why did these get in there and those didn't? Why did this dude who lived part of his life in a cave get to be the one who made this decision, and then the Council of Nicaea said, yep, that sounds good.
Go ahead.
Would you like to discuss that? Because I would happily get on that soapbox.
I promised Jacob we'd talk about The Last Jedi, too, so maybe we don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole.
I'm down with talking about the Council of Nicaea as well. I mean, I don't know as much, but I am aware of its significance. But
let's talk about the scripture. I mean, we will probably logically circle back to both the Council of Nicaea and The Last Jedi in the course of talking about the scripture, which is not something you can say about very many other things.
Not at all.
No.
Not at all.
Maybe in this house.
Well, yeah.
Definitely in this house.
Well, when you have a religion minor and,
a nerd.
I was about to say.
I wasn't going to say a nerd. I was just going to talk about the numerous posters on the wall, plus the framed Jeff Loeb Batman comic books. We'll have to talk about that offline, but I found that interesting. Just a whole run of Jeff Loeb books.
I will actually explain that real quick because it's not a long story. The reason that those are framed and the reason I have those were the first series of comics that I ever went to the store and bought.
Okay.
When I was in school. Like, I didn't get into comics until probably freshman, sophomore year of high school. So a little bit of a latecomer in terms of comics, but that was the first story I read. It has always been my favorite Batman story. I'm still pissed off that they haven't made this into a film, but that's a whole other conversation.
So I didn't look that closely at it. Which story is it?
It's the Hush storyline.
Okay. I have read that in an assembled volume, I believe.
Yes.
So
yes,
but yeah,
and actually, from a business standpoint, that series was what really brought Batman back to the forefront in terms of comic sales. It kind of saved them at the time.
And
From
yet,
Nicaea to Batman.
And yet, year one is what brought the movies back.
Do what?
Year one is what brought the movies back.
Year one was actually written in the...
no, I know it was written in the 80s, but it had a very heavy influence on Batman Begins.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But, yeah, even if Christopher Nolan won't admit it because he knows Frank Miller will jump straight down his throat.
If you think about it, Molly, it's not that big of a leap because both of those topics are inherently about canon.
True.
Yep.
Oh,
I mean,
wow.
No,
well done.
No, really though, because that's canon is debated in the comic book universe constantly. I mean,
Absolutely.
as new movies get made and
which canon they're going to stick
which one they're going to stick with.
Yeah.
It also very much ties into what was mentioned earlier, which was Star Wars Last Jedi, because of various reasons that will probably be brought up at that time.
Oh, they absolutely will be brought up because, a lot of what's gone on around that, this scripture is very directly applicable to, especially the part, where, Rey chops a rock in half with a lightsaber. Yeah. Oh, wait, no, not that part. So then, putting away falsehood, let all of us speak the truth to our neighbors, for we are members of one another. Okay. So, the author of Ephesians, whether or not it's Paul, is not messing around when he starts off this passage. Don't lie. Tell the truth. We're all one together. It's like, I am the walrus, I am you, and you are me, and he is she, and we are all together.
Cuckoo-choo.
Exactly. So, it's just with that starting verse, it's interesting to think about how deeply our culture has devolved into one in which we insist on demonizing one another a lot of the time if we are supposed to be members of one another. And this divide is probably more apparent within the church than just within greater American culture. Because if you think about who are the people you commonly see yelling, build the wall, or throw them out, or lock her up, if you will, when they absolutely should not be yelling that. It's people in the church.
Yeah.
And, the thing is, I can't sit here and say that that's just I think Caitie's trying to find a Bible.
Yeah. If you just want to, there you go.
Yeah, and not knock over a chess set. Is that a Lord of the Rings? Yes, it is.
The chess set?
No, not the chess set. The book behind the Bible. Oh no,
that is a book of photos and
costumes of 2016
from Dragon Con.
Ah, okay.
I'm actually in that. I'm surprised.
Yeah, fascinating. Dragon Con's in Atlanta, right?
It is in Atlanta.
Yeah, okay. That's what I thought. Anyway, tangent. Anyway, so what I was saying is I can't just sit here and demonize the evangelical and more fundamentalist church for doing exactly that, because the liberal church is just as bad about demonizing the other side, rather than, I won't say all of them, but a lot of the liberal church, rather than working to find common ground, is just going to be like, F you guys. You know what? You're a bunch of heretics. Go to hell. So, it's like, what can we do to actually, be what we're supposed to be? You're going to have to get closer to your microphone. You can't just lean back and chill.
I was going to sit back up. Jeez.
Well, I think from from my perspective, as far as the discord that is out there now, of course, my experience does not circle as much around the church, either fundamentalist or liberal.
Right.
Although I do see it on a political scale. What I do see is, I've already gotten some weird looks about being a nerd, so
We're all nerds.
not.
We're all nerds.
We were just
here.
acknowledging the truthfulness.
touche. But it is something that I have seen and observed in the in different nerd communities. Is this desire to be right at all costs kind of thing, and even if that means throwing a fellow fan of a series that you enjoy under the bus.
Sure.
I think we saw that a lot with the release of Last Jedi and the controversy and the issues that have surrounded that film. But it has also kind of reared its head in almost every fandom that exists out there in some form or fashion. And the innocent side of that would go back to, say, people upset on how the Harry Potter films were done versus the way the books were, and what was left out and what was done in this regard. Or, and I think that that's kind of created this society that is... There's a thought there.
Divisive.
A very divisive society that...
It's always looking for a fight.
It is.
Yeah.
It really is.
Well, and to your point about The Last Jedi, I think in the Star Wars fandom, you can look all the way back to The Phantom Menace, to when things started getting ugly back in 1999, just because that movie was, I mean, without putting too fine a point on it, it was an abysmal movie.
And I agree. And that came out probably at the height of my personal fandom, because I started watching it. I started watching the series a little bit before the special edition re-release in '97.
Sure.
Going into the release of Episode 1 when it came out, and at the time, loved it. It was all great.
Well, yeah, I mean, hell, when I saw it, I was like, yes, Star Wars NASCAR, okay,
yeah, sure,
I'll do it. But and if you think about how negative some of the reactions were to it, Jake Lloyd, who played little Anakin Skywalker, was driven out of acting. He didn't want to act anymore. Ahmed Best, who played Jar Jar Binks, considered suicide.
Yeah.
So distraught was he by the reaction of the Star Wars fandom to him, not to Jar Jar, but to him as a person. And then you fast forward 16 years to The Force Awakens, and you have fans going after Daisy Ridley so hard that she leaves social media entirely. 2 years later, Kelly Marie Tran has to do the same thing because Rose Tico was just demonized, even though if you watch The Last Jedi, Rose Tico is a Star Wars fan.
Absolutely.
That is what she is. She is the personification of a Star Wars fan on the big screen.
Well, and I think that The Last Jedi in general, that a lot of people tend to miss as far as what the story was entailing in that regard it was a story of letting go of legends, letting go of your belief in the legends of the past. I realize the irony. And kind of building that future for yourself. You saw that with Luke being a failure. You saw that with Finn trying to leave. You saw that with, and I know this is something very special to you, with Poe being should have been court-martialed.
Oh, speaking of which, did you see that some people at a con recently did a mock court-martial for him?
I did.
Yeah,
I did. I did not see the verdict, but
guilty. So effing guilty. I believe reduction in rank and time served in the brig was the sentence, which he fully deserved. But so if you think about that, let's just look at. Let's set aside the whole fandom bit for a moment and just look within the structure of The Last Jedi. Let all of us speak the truth to our neighbors. Luke Skywalker tries to speak the truth to Rey and tell her the Jedi were messed up and power hungry, and it was their own craving for power that led to Palpatine's rise, that led to the destruction of the Jedi Temple and the murder of the Jedi Order. She didn't want to hear it. even though she needed to. We are members of one another. If you're supposed to be part of this very special group of people, Ray, you have to understand.
This is what led to their downfall.
This is what led to their downfall.
Yeah, and I would say that their downfall was desire for power, but I would also say it was hubris. It was pride that led to it, in the sense that they thought they had control over everything and they were fine. And then you see in Luke recounting this, and even if you go back and look at some of the canon with Yoda, he started to realize it right at the tail end of the war.
Right.
Going into, and then he's the one that taught Luke, yada yada yada, and you have,
and that, to that point, it does. We can transition right from there into the next two verses. Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger, and do not make room for the devil. And it is possible that this podcast might be suddenly about the gospel according to Paul as it relates to the Last Jedi, but I'm okay with that because, ladies. Any objections? If you think about it, the downfall of the Jedi, they made room for the devil.
Yes.
Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. Okay, and that's, that takes us all the way back to Phantom Menace, when Yoda is telling Anakin Skywalker that he can't be angry because anger leads to the dark side. And here yet we see Paul, the most verbose apostle of Christ, as we understand in the most basic understanding of the canon, saying anger is good as long as you don't let it result in sin, which obviously Anakin let his anger result in sin. Yes?
So I'm going to argue that I, for a long time, have thought, like, whenever I've watched Star Wars and watched all the scenes where Luke is getting trained and he's saying, don't give in to your anger, don't give in to your anger, I'm like, that is such bullshit.
It is. Yeah, it is.
Because
George Lucas, San Francisco 1970s New Age bullshit.
Yeah, and it's
never heard it put that way, but yeah.
And it treats anger like it belongs purely, like, if you think about good and evil in a really dualistic way, like, anger belongs on the side of evil when anger has its place in the good. And I was going to say this earlier with the divisions that we're experiencing right now. It's at the heart of division is trauma that is unrecognized and hasn't been worked through, whether that's trauma on a systemic level, which you could argue a lot of the arguments we're having society about racism and gender equality, that is trauma that we have not reckoned with and that we haven't asked for forgiveness for. And when dudes are trolling women on the internet, like, it's this unrecognized need to deal with the fact that they too are vulnerable and have feelings, and trying so hard to fit into this pigeonhole niche of what it means to be masculine, and to be masculine is to fight. So when they see something like The Last Jedi, where the person who is leading, who is renewing the movement and is taking the old institution of the Jedi back to its mystical ways, which does not define good or evil by dualistic ideas, unconsciously there's some they feel threatened. I mean, I don't know if any of that makes sense.
Absolutely. A lot of sense.
It does, and if you think about it, for episode 9, the 3 main white cisgender heterosexual characters, they're all gone. Han Solo is dead, Luke Skywalker is dead, and Princess Leia, we don't know her fate, but Carrie Fisher, rest in peace.
Yeah, God rest her soul.
That's right. God rest your soul, Carrie Fisher. Pour one out. Princess Leia is going to obviously have a very reduced role in the movie because they're doing her role entirely based on footage that was shot for Force Awakens and Last Jedi.
Correct.
So that means that this mega billion-dollar franchise is going to be led by a white woman, a black man, a Latino man, and an Asian woman. And that scares the shit out of some people.
It does. It does. And I think that and going back to talking about anger and how middle-aged men or men in general have reacted so poorly to these kind of things. I mean, I remember reading not too long after the release that some people wanted to re-edit the film to take out this whole feminism thing.
Oh, yeah.
Oh.
No, somebody actually did such an edit, and
That's
it was
right.
like 19 minutes long.
Yeah, I heard it was terrible.
Yeah, I'm sure it was. I never watched it.
I didn't either. And I think it does go back to this fear that the power that they have wielded for so many years and has been represented in media, whether it be film, television, comics, whatever, is slowly going away. Look at the success of Wonder Woman over the failure of Justice League, Batman versus Superman, even Man of Steel. Those were not as big of hits as they theoretically should be, but Wonder Woman kicked ass. That's still one of my favorite movies. But you look at Last Jedi, and it is very much a changing of the guard, and it is talking about how, not so much Last Jedi, but talking throughout the entire series. You look at it and you do see the reduction of the masculine machismo, however you want to look at it. At the end of Return of the Jedi, you had Luke Skywalker as the hero. You had Lando Calrissian as the hero. You had Han Solo as the hero. But at the end of Last Jedi, you have Rey being the one that saved him from the cave, which I'm sure there's some allegory there. You had Rose saving Finn.
Saving Finn from going on a suicide run to take out the battering ram thingy. Battering ram cannon?
Yeah.
Death Star tech.
That was very vague, but yeah.
Yes.
And they even said, she said something along the lines,
We do not save ourselves by killing the things we hate, but by saving the things we love.
Yep.
That's how we're going to win. Which stands in direct opposition to Kylo Ren's statement of, let the past die, kill it if you have to.
yes.
I think there is merit, certainly, in letting the past die. But when you actively fight against something, that's when you stand against this idea that we are all members of one another.
Right.
And I think, every time I see an article online, like published by BuzzFeed, about how millennials are killing something or how boomers have screwed up something else, I'm like, why are we pitting these two generations against each other?
Because it's a distraction.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yes, the boomers screwed a lot of things up for the millennials. And yes, the millennials have become a very entitled generation as a result. However, pitting the two against one another serves nobody's interests at all. Except for, like, a few rich people.
Yeah. I was going to say, there are some that benefit. Anytime there's anything in media, you ask who's benefiting.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and at the heart of all of it, because I was saying earlier that there's unacknowledged trauma. There's also this fear of things not being simple anymore. There not being any simple answers. I don't know how they're going to carry it forward into the next Star Wars movie, but I love the fact that it seems to have been not confirmed yet, but sort of inferred that Rey is neither purely light nor dark. She's a mix.
Yeah.
And that's actually what makes her powerful, is she knows how to maintain the balance.
Yes.
She operates in shades of gray.
Right.
And you could argue that makes her a great Jedi, but I think that the idea of her being that balance is very important, whereas you have Kylo, who is very dark. He is conflicted. They have done a good job of showing that in the last one, but he is very much in the dark. And I think going into Episode 9, he will represent the old mentality of there being a light and a dark, whereas you have to have that sort of you have to have that balance. I mean, like you said a minute ago about being angry but do not sin. There are things that you need to rage about, and a great example would be Jesus kicking the money changers out of the temple.
Yep.
That was a very angry reaction.
Oh, sure.
But it was...
And I really wish we had more examples in the Gospels of Jesus being angry, because that's the one we always use to talk about
It is.
anger. And I'm like, we need more stories.
I think there are some where you can infer.
You can
anger on Jesus'
infer it,
part.
but it's not so explicit.
Like the death of the temple leader's little daughter, when he goes into the house and he's like, "Why are all you people standing around here crying? She's not dead. Why do you have so little faith?" You know, that one. Then get thee behind me, Satan, to Peter. I can imagine him being pretty pissed off at Peter in that moment.
Sure.
And then even when James and John wanted to be seated at his right and left, and he's like, "Are you kidding me right now? That's not my call, guys. Come on."
But then we roll back to the Council of Nicaea.
All right.
And remember that what we read is what was determined by a bunch of old white guys.
That's true.
Yes.
In a time that is not today, that they were like, we don't really like this version of the story. Let's not put that in there.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why we have all the Gnostic Gospels.
Right.
And all the ones that didn't make it in.
All the Apocrypha, all the pseudepigrapha.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which on a personal level are my favorite.
Right.
Because I love to read those stories that nobody necessarily really always talks about. And those different views.
Right. Well, and that circles back to what we've been talking about, because they were building the foundations of what would become the institution of the church.
Exactly.
And what do they throw out? They throw out all of the texts that were the least legalistic, like the least like black and white. All of the texts that had women at the forefront.
All of the texts that had Jesus as a mystic.
Yeah, Jesus as a mystic. They all get thrown out.
Exactly. And, of course, there may be still caves full of jars with text that we still haven't even found.
Yeah.
Because, unfortunately, we don't have the libraries. They don't exist because of all the unfortunate things that have happened in history. So maybe there are stories out there of Jesus being angry. We just, unfortunately, are not privy to them.
Here's a thought. Maybe God didn't want those texts to exist today. Maybe God wanted us to figure these things out for ourselves and not have to rely on a church structure that requires us to believe this or burn in hell. Why else would God give us free will?
Again, I think it all depends on your theology. How involved do you think God was, and whether or not text made it into the canon, or if you're like me, you believe God makes good out of everything that God can, and we can learn a lesson from all of it if we're open to it. But
look, for all I know, Christopher Moore was actually divinely inspired by the Holy Spirit when he wrote Lamb, the Gospel According to Biff.
I love that book.
It's a great book.
It's fantastic.
I still need to read that book.
Oh
I
my
have not
gosh.
read it.
I have like the leather-bound, gold-leafed
That's
version.
exactly the version I have
Yes.
too. The one that looks like a Bible.
Yes.
Yeah. No, it's on our bookshelf at home. You can pick it up and read it.
Oh,
anytime.
please do. It's worth the read.
I need to. Jimmy rereads it, I feel like, about every year. Just about. You reread it pretty
I read it back in
frequently.
the spring. That was the first time I had read it since we were in Gower. So
Yeah.
it had been a few years.
I pick it up every 2 or 3
Meanwhile, my
years.
yearly reread is a comic called Kingdom Come. The comic series drawn by Alex Ross.
I don't think I'm familiar with that one.
Oh,
My yearly comic reread is Watchmen.
That's a good one.
So
Well, that's a good choice.
while we're talking about canon, this is one of my favorite questions to ask, maybe ever. If the canon was still open and we could take any text from any time period, current, past, written by somebody living or dead, and you wanted to add it into the canon, what would you add?
Martin Luther King, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. That would be an epistle.
Yes, it would.
That's a good one.
Oh, that is a good one. I'm going to have to think about that one.
That's a loaded question.
It is a loaded
It's a
question.
very good question.
We may come back to that.
Yeah, we can come back. It is a hard one.
Yeah.
I don't even know that I have an answer to it. But I remember when we were in school, somebody wrote an editorial about that question, about wishing that that we could reopen the canon, because if we believe that God was speaking to all these different people who wrote different pieces of our ancient scriptures, then why don't we think that God is still speaking in an equally valid way now? in things that are being written right now?
That's a good question. That's a very good point.
I think it's Robin Williams. I think it was Robin Williams, or was some stand-up comedian that said, "Oh, that's just the crazy ones you see on the street talking to themselves."
So
That makes me think sometimes in my work. I'm not kidding.
who of you are prophets and who of you are just nuts? Honestly, I think another good version, I know that What Would Jesus Do kind of got co-opted by the evangelical and fundamentalist movements in the 90s, but the original book, In His Steps, written by Charles Sheldon in the 1890s, I think would be a great parabolic addition to the canon, because Charles Sheldon was a Congregationalist Christian socialist. He believed that each person should be able to determine for themselves what their life needed, and that the church as a whole was responsible for the well-being of everybody, because that is what Jesus would do. And I think that would be a great addition to the canon. But, the canon was decided 1,500 years ago by a bunch of dead people. So,
Well, we can change it. They won't notice.
can you imagine the fit that some people would pitch if somebody, legitimately suggested reopening the canon?
Oh, yeah.
And what would be even worse is some of the names of writings or people that are coming to my mind are non-Christians that I would want to put in there, and that's the problem, because the first person that came to my head was Gandhi, and I'm like, wait a minute.
So here's here's the thing: no Christians wrote any part of the Bible.
Right, technically.
Yep.
As far as we understand Christians, none of the Bible was written by Christians.
Right, but that wouldn't fly in society now, is what I'm saying.
Not.
But
Yeah, I would put Rumi in the canon. Or I feel like I always say it wrong. Hafiz? What is it?
Hafiz?
Hafiz, yeah. Rumi or Hafiz, because they're both mystic poets. And to me, speak to me just as much, if not more, than anything I read in a psalm or...
There you go.
And elsewhere in the Bible.
But then I'm also tempted to say someone like C.S. Lewis.
Yes.
Who
sure.
Does that merit, because you're talking about someone that did fiction writing, does that merit something that's a historical text?
Well,
Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe totally belongs in the canon.
How about a Psalm of Lament subtitled Jesus Walks by Kanye West? I mean...
Yeah.
There's so much out there.
Oh, God, the ego that would go along with that.
Well,
yeah, we don't need Kanye published in the Bible. Never mind.
Yeah, true.
I mean...
No, I can totally agree with that. I can't think of a specific example, but there have been things in my learnings, or journey, however you want to put it, that would not have come from Christian sources, but I would consider just as important to my spiritual journey as I would anything that I've read out of the Bible or any other literature that I've read.
Well, and for me sometimes too, I've tried to explain this to a few people, particularly when I run into people who are kind of mystified sometimes that I'm not that I don't believe in proselytizing the way people in other branches of Christianity do. But for me, what makes it holy is the fact that sometimes when I read something outside my faith tradition, I understand and appreciate better my own tradition, because it speaks the truth in a way that helps me better understand my own tradition, just by saying it a little differently.
Makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, it's actually, if you think about it, reading Muslim texts about Jesus, it gives you a more human perspective on him. Because, of course, they believe he was a great prophet, second only to Muhammad. But they also believe he was just human. They
Right.
do believe he was divinely conceived, born of a virgin, but they believe he was just human. They believe that when he was set to be crucified, somebody else took his place on the cross and he bodily ascended into heaven, much like Elijah. They believe that at the end of days, Jesus is going to come to earth and every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Allah is the Lord. It's really not that different from what Christian culture believes about Jesus, but it's a different perspective on it. And yet, so much of Christianity demonizes Islam to such a severe degree. And it's like, this is exactly why Abraham was not supposed to sleep with his maidservant.
And that's God, years ago I wrote on that exact subject, and that Christianity, and please correct me if I'm incorrect, if I'm wrong, but Christianity, Judaism, and Islam very much stem from obviously the same area of the country or area of the world,
Right.
and are in a sense, brothers in terms of
Absolutely.
the way I've always felt. But now we live in a society worldwide that, as you said, demonizes not just Christian, but that sort of mentality very much demonizes Islam or looks down upon anything that is not Christian. I can actually look back at a experience I had when I was much younger, in that I asked a minister about Buddhism, and caused a lot of people to get upset.
Yeah. I remember this.
I know you did. I was being vague on purpose.
Yeah, you don't have to be vague.
Well,
Fine, it was at your church.
Nice. So, and the thing about that, especially, Jesus in Buddhism, there is a Buddhist monk, Thich Nhat Hanh, who has written at great length about the connection between the teachings of Jesus and the teachings of Buddhism. Living Buddha, Living Christ is probably his best known work. And then there's a Jesuit priest by the name of Paul Knitter, who used to be, he is retired now, he was on the faculty at Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University in New York, and he wrote a book called Without Buddhism, I Could Not Be a Christian. So they're both great reads. Living Buddha, Living Christ is a little more abstract, whereas Without Buddhism, I Could Not Be a Christian is very much more concrete and specific to Paul Knitter's life. I was going somewhere with that. Oh, right. Back to Christianity and Islam. I don't remember. It's okay.
Well, if we truly lived the letter of the law that is outlined in the Bible, pretty much like what some people define fundamentalist Christians to do, then we would have the same problems as using the universal we,
right,
for we as Christians. We would have the same problems with ourselves that we do with Islam, in things like we would not treat women the same way we do now. We would have a lot of the same issues. So it's very
counterintuitive.
Yeah.
We would, however, treat the widow, the orphan, and the alien as our own because we were once strangers in a strange land. But never mind that.
No one listens to that part.
Yeah.
That's actually in Leviticus, like 3 chapters after all the verses that get quoted about same-sex marriage.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That doesn't surprise me. And I think if you look through, because we've kind of danced around it, but I think if you look through history as a whole, you will see people using not just Christianity, but any faith, but a lot of times Christianity to their advantage to either cause a division within their people,
right?
To make murders or terrible acts okay because they are done in a religious manner,
like the Crusades.
Like the Crusades.
Yep.
When hundreds of thousands of Jews and Muslims were slaughtered in the name of reclaiming the Holy Land.
The Inquisition.
The Inquisition.
Nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition.
No.
Well, and
I
what
went Mel Brooks. You went.
I went Monty Python. Yeah,
both
good
absolutely
directions.
legitimate. But
Well, and I think so. I'm not kidding. I've got a book brewing about this very issue. It's been brewing for a while. I don't know when I'm going to have time to actually put it on paper, but I feel like part of the reason that's been allowed to happen is because people who co-opt religion for their own purposes, particularly with Christianity, know they can, whether they are aware, like whether they're consciously aware of the fact that they can. They've picked up on the fact that most practitioners of Christianity, they've ignored the scripture we're talking about. They've ignored the fact that you're called to be more than just sweet and nice. Like, you're called to embody your anger when it's called for in order to fight against justice. But historically, Christianity gets co-opted to hurt people, and because Christians have been taught to be sweet and passive and respect authority in all forms, things don't get questioned and people get hurt. And we're seeing it right now, and it happened during World War II. It just happens over and over again.
Well, two quote, or not quotes, but two things that I can remember. And this one actually goes back to Rebecca, something she said that has stuck with me all these years, and kind of plays off of what you were just saying. Is that, and I don't remember the exact grades, but she said something along the lines of, a normal church-going citizen only has what would classify as like a third grade understanding of religion.
Yes.
Most leaders only, like most ministers in a church, only have like a fifth grade understanding. And then there's all this other that just they don't understand or have not been exposed to or whatever.
Right.
And the thing is, that's only the Christian faith. It's like that. The Jewish faith and the Muslim faith, you're expected to have a thorough knowledge of all the scriptures by the time you come of age. For the Jewish faith, that's your bar mitzvah, your bat mitzvah. You have to be able to stand up there in front of everybody and quote scriptures at will. You know, whatever the rabbi says, you quote that, you have to quote that. And then, like, talking to rabbis who I went through officer development school and chaplain school with, first of all, they have the equivalent of multiple PhDs by the time they can become a rabbi. They basically have to have the entire Old Testament memorized in Hebrew in order to be a rabbi. You know, they don't mess around, whereas you're right. Our ministers, a lot of them, not to put too fine a point on it, are crap.
They are crap, or they allow their personal emotions and personal views to corrupt what is a very beautiful religion at its core, I believe. In my barely third grade understanding of it, but you end up with that expansion of ignorance in a lot of ways, and it's your churchgoer sitting in the pew listening to the minister that doesn't know quite what he's talking about to the extent that he probably should.
Right.
And that goes into what what I see as an outsider to Islam and Judaism is a much deeper dedication to their faith.
Yeah.
Something I respect the hell out of. And the other quote that I wanted to use was, you mentioned fear. We've mentioned anger. Back to Phantom Menace.
Right.
Fear leads to anger. Anger leads to hate. Hate leads to suffering.
Suffering leads to
the dark side.
Exactly.
And that right there in a quick little explains the issue.
Yeah. Well, and so off on a tangent. Though we may speak poorly of the prequel trilogy, I think there was some hidden genius in it, specifically with the exploration of the gray areas of the Force and how fundamentalism did send Anakin down the path he went down.
Absolutely.
And I think that's part of like Yoda's destruction of the tree that Luke thought had the Jedi texts in it in The Last Jedi. That is part of Yoda's penance, if you will. But I think the key to this passage is the last two verses, where it says, "Therefore be imitators of God as beloved children, and live in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us." You know, a lot of the evangelical tradition really focuses in on sacrificial atonement theology. The idea that Jesus had to die this horrible death in order for God to forgive us, which is utter bullshit. There is nothing that mankind could do to change God's mind one way or the other. God already knew what was going to happen. God sent Jesus to say, hey, let's un-F ourselves and figure out a better way to live. And Jesus died because Jesus upset the culture and the powers. And the death is not the important part. The resurrection is.
Footnote, substitutionary atonement, still in the grand scheme of history, very new concept.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Not as ancient as people think it is.
But
I'm actually going to need a little explanation on that.
So
Jesus died a horrible death, therefore we're good.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But so the point of that is that, so much of the church still leans on that substitutionary atonement idea, but they don't lean on the whole Christ loved us, therefore we must love one another part.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And that's, I think, part of the divisiveness of the church. And then, again, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the traditions that have tossed substitutionary atonement, which is fine, but then they end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater. They end up throwing out the part of Christ loved us so much that Christ did this voluntarily. And a lot of the time, you miss it on both ends. And it's like, if we are to be as Christ, we have to love one another even unto death. Because sometimes they know not what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And to tie it to Last Jedi, it's the, we will win not by destroying that which we hate,
but by saving that which we love. Yeah.
And yeah.
And sometimes that involves a force projection across the galaxy with Kylo Ren shooting all his guns at you and General Hux saying, "Do you think you got him?"
Mm-hmm.
Which, by the way, I think that entire scene is the epitome of what a Jedi should be.
Yeah.
And that is a controversial thought for a lot of people.
Luke was completely passive in that scene.
Completely passive, used the Force for defense, not for attack, used it to protect others, to escape.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. He didn't kill what he hated, he saved what he loved.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. But this last passage actually embodies a lot of the reason why I left the organized church.
Okay.
Because growing up in the church that I did here in Winston-Salem, it blew my mind a little bit that there was one day a year that was day of service for the church, where everyone in the church signed up to go to the food bank, to Habitat for Humanity, something like that.
Right.
Whatever. And yet, there was a very big deal put on whether you were tithing every Sunday to put money back into the church. And I grew up in a single mom with 3-kid household, and money was very tight.
Tithing wasn't really an option.
It was a little.
Sure.
But I remember getting kind of dirty looks in church because it was, we see how much you're putting in the collection plate or whatever.
Right.
And yet, we always ushered. We always wanted to volunteer. We were always the first to sign up to go out or help or whatever, which is how my mother raised us, is what you should do. If you couldn't give monetarily, then you gave time and service.
Yeah.
And
I hated ushering, by the way.
that the structure of the church just put such an emphasis on that and so little on the actual human beings that we should be serving.
Right.
Not only the members of the church, but all of those people that were around us. I remember once when I was younger, we had a minister who had 3 sons. And the oldest son, one Sunday, dressed up like he was homeless and sat outside the church to see if anyone would invite him in.
Wow.
And no one did.
Wow.
I've heard of that being done a couple of times where where maybe it's not the child, but it's the minister themselves who have made themselves up to look, Or there was an article I read a few years ago where a minister went and spent time as a homeless person to see kind of what that side was and see if anybody would reach out and help. And it's
disheartening.
It is. And I mean, I for one, I'm very guilty of walking past people or driving past people asking for money and for various reasons.
His son was older at the time. He was an older teen, maybe a young 20-something. So Howard, who was our minister, started the church service, processed everybody in, started everything, and walked out and went and got Jeff and told everyone who he was and told him what he had done. And just the shame, the absolute feeling of shame. But that's the way it is. You know? So it was much more fulfilling to find that sense of service in college.
Sure.
Because thankfully I did go to a school where that was much more, something that we did. But even now, I find that I do stuff more on an individual basis. As a spiritual person, than I think I would if I was in an organized group. Because there's just not really the basis for it. As much so as I think we're really told for there to be.
Well, and I've been toying with this more and more of late since I work in what is not... It's ministry to me, but it wouldn't be considered by others to be ministerial context because it's
non-traditional.
Right. It's not traditional ministry. I don't work for an organization that has any, it is not religious in any way.
Your executive director is a Baptist minister.
She is, but she, that's outside the main office.
She wants to keep her job.
I think any kind of nonprofit work is a form of ministry in my personal opinion, but that's because I know how much money we make.
Right. No, for sure. No, but I've been thinking about this more and more. I mean, sometimes I don't know that I have time for it, but at least at this point in my life, I feel like the only way I can lead a community is if it's like a little community out of my living room. And sometimes I want to create that because I so badly want people like you and Jacob to be in a spiritual community with me. But I know the reasons why you aren't, and they're valid reasons. So, I mean, I kind of feel like these days the only kind of community I'm interested in leading is one that's made up of people who, are willing to take a leap of faith and actually join something that is not, that is technically organized religion, but is a response to, organized religion, and that it's trying to be the antithesis of that thing.
And my observations, I think that organized religion as a whole will head that way, especially with our generation in general. Because if there is a anti-establishment generation, it is definitely ours. Well, one could argue the hippies, but
yeah, the Gen Xers started it, but the millennials perfected it.
I saw something recently that was very like made me feel good. Was that it was something from a Gen Xer, and it was like, look, we helped build the platforms you guys are using to reach out and to speak to others. I mean, the internet, one thing I wanted to say was to go back of, for we are members of one another. The internet is the epitome of that, in my opinion. And I think but the quote I had seen, it was something along the lines of, we built the tools that you guys are using, and we have just been waiting for you guys. Please come and join us in the sun, kind of thing. Yep. And I think we're finally starting to see that happen. I mean, if you look at the responses that we've had, again, to our current administration, if you see the responses that have been born of the Walk for Our Lives movement or the Women's March and things of that nature, you're starting to see more of a organized outreach towards, hey, these are some messed up things that are going on in society. We really need to get a handle on it. You guys aren't doing anything about it. We're going to have to do something about it. Right? And I think, and that to me makes me feel a lot better about the future generation. And then I listen to some of their music.
Even the generation right under us is doing a great job.
Absolutely.
I work personally with those guys. I can tell you, I don't know, you guys have probably all seen recently things like the young lady who wrote a letter to the editor about the use of gender pronouns in something that had been printed about how she found it was very unfair. This I know because it was on a personal level about Scouts, Boy Scouts versus Girl Scouts.
Sure.
But it's gone nationwide, and this girl is not even 14 years old.
The guys that started the Walk for Our Lives were the victims of the
Marjorie
shooting.
Stoneman Douglas High School kids.
Yes.
Who are literally kids. They are teenagers. They are Gen Z. And yet, I mean, if you think back to the March for Our Lives in March, when the one girl whose name I'm spacing
Emma?
out right at the moment,
Emma
Gonzalez. Yeah. When she just stood there silent for 170 seconds, 10 seconds for each of the victims. And it's like, guys, this is a high school junior right here doing this.
She brought me to tears, by the way, during that.
Yeah.
Like, I watched that video afterwards. I was not able to see it live, but I watched that video afterwards, and I was sitting there literally crying, just right along, because I understood that.
And I'll tell you something else right now. I have not heard a single peep about The Last Jedi from that generation.
Nope.
No,
They
No.
like it.
and that's a whole other thesis of my own, in the sense that I believe that Star Wars has definitely become a generational piece, much like
Sure.
and I think it will, as time goes on, if they continue to make things, or if they continue to use it sparingly, I think it will take on kind of a life of its own. Which, not to use what they've called the expanded universe, but it has become its own legend.
Right.
In the sense that the original trilogy was definitely for that generation that was fresh out of the Vietnam
That was for
War.
your late boomers, your early Gen Xers.
Yep. Then you had the
Prequels,
that
which was your late Gen Xers and early millennials.
Yep. And now you're having
The Bush
trilogy.
era, post 9/11.
Yeah.
Yeah, which, if you look at the storylines, is very...
This is how liberty dies, to the sound of thunderous applause.
which is my favorite quote, possibly from the entire series.
Again,
Saying
you know,
something.
those three movies, not very good movies, but there was a lot of great stuff within them.
That would be our cat.
Sorry.
He has feelings about Attack of the Clones, as do we all. But then, of course, and the new movies, those are for the late millennials and Gen Z. Force Awakens, The Last Jedi. I think Rogue One, to a certain extent, kind of harkens back
I agree.
a little bit. Although, I will say this, because this has been on my mind for a little while. So, all the pissed off people about the death of Admiral Akbar, he died quickly and unceremoniously. Frickin', if you want to talk about Mon Calamarians who got shit done, General Radis did way freaking more than Admiral Akbar ever did. What did
Absolutely.
Akbar ever do? He sat back and watched as an A-Wing crashed into the bridge of the Executor, and then it crashed into the Death Star. Whereas Radis, he showed up and he got shit done over Scarab.
Yes, he did.
He had a Hammerhead Corvette drive a Star Destroyer into the shield gate, and then he held off Vader, Darth freaking Vader, long enough for Princess Leia to get out and put the plans in R2-D2.
Absolutely.
You're welcome.
Which, couple of quick things, the Hammerhead ship that was in that film was recanonized from
Clone Wars. Or was it Rebels?
No, it was recanonized from the Knights of the Old Republic series. So there has been some recanonization.
Well, yeah,
along
the Thrawn
the years.
Naruto. So,
Yep.
just saying.
And in fact, I'm sure you are aware of this, but the ship they were on in Last Jedi was the Radis.
Right, yes.
And named after
the one that Admiral Holdo destroyed the First Order fleet with.
Yeah, which was an amazing shot. But something that I wanted to say back, kind of what we were talking about the generational thing, and about kind of what we're experiencing now on a social level with this derision or divisiveness that has gone on socially, and from everything from the Black Lives Matter movement and etc. is, I personally think, is the dying of that mentality. And in The Great Dictator, which was a film by Charlie Chaplin back in 1940 or 1939, I believe,
During Hitler's peak.
During Hitler's peak, and it was actually, which, by the way, Charlie Chaplin had a lot of controversy over this speech. And in the movie, he plays both kind of a version of his, a version of his normal character that he always plays,
His comical self.
Comical self, but he also played this dictator that was very much the pastiche of Hitler. Into the film, one of the first times that Charlie Chaplin, I believe, was ever recorded
Speaking on film.
He said this whole speech, but I'll only bring out one part of it. He says, "To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish. And it is my hope that that is what we're seeing now." That entire speech, if you ever get a chance, is one of my favorite in film ever. And he almost lost his career over it. But sometimes you got to make that risk, or you got to take that risk.
That's true.
I feel like that was like a benediction just now.
I feel like that's as good a note as any to wrap up the scripture part of the podcast on, especially since we're at an hour 20.
Yeah, unless there's closing thoughts.
So any last thoughts on this passage? Since we didn't even get to the "let no evil talk come out of your mouths" part.
Well, I didn't trash talk our current president, so I guess I followed that part.
Well done. You get a cookie.
Hey, apparently those sound amazing from what you said that they said over at the Divinity School. So I demand a cookie.
I did not bring any cookies with me tonight.
Well, you owe me one.
I meant to make some cookies, but oh well. I make lots of cookies at Christmas, so
fair enough.
And I will.
He'll deliver cookies to you.
That's
Excellent.
right. I will get in my car and drive to Winston-Salem and deliver cookies to you.
Very much enjoyed it.
Yeah. Well, we do a shout out at the end.
Yes. So, setting aside scripture for the moment, and this could be in religious culture, this could be in secular culture. What is a pop culture thing that you are enjoying right now?
So my current Netflix binge was just I Am a Killer is the series. I love...
Is that the, true crime interviews with serial killers?
Yes, it is.
Oh, my gosh.
Well, they're not necessarily serial killers. They are men that are on death row.
Okay.
They are all going to die. And it was very interesting when we spoke earlier in the podcast about trauma. Because every single one of them, if you really truly listen to their stories, it all relates back to the trauma in their life and their upbringing. And it's just very sad what society has done to these men. Mm-hmm. But I highly recommend it as a Netflix binge. They were just very insightful and excellent episodes.
Sure.
Yeah. I'm always messing up the name of it. Have you watched the show? It came out last fall. But it was about the guys back in the 70s who were trying to figure out the psychology of serial
Hunters.
Mind Hunters. Thank you. I always forget it. Have you watched that?
I haven't watched that one yet.
And,
you have to watch it.
Okay.
What's her name? Anna Torv from Fringe. She's in it as well.
No, I haven't done that one yet.
You would enjoy that.
I love to do the true story ones. So, like The Staircase, about the author in Raleigh that supposedly killed his wife.
Yeah.
And the one about the nun that died, and a bunch of those. I love those.
My mom is super into all of that. We tease her.
Guilty pleasure.
We tease her for being into murder porn.
Well, you're welcome to tease me too, because it is a guilty pleasure. I will not lie. Cannot tell a lie.
I would say my recent, I'm not sure it would count as pop culture anymore, but my recent obsession, and it's only been about a week, is I've gone back and started playing the old SimCity games.
Nice. We talking like SimCity 2000?
Yes,
DOS
2000 and
yeah.
3000. And it's a much different experience as an adult playing it, because I can remember as a kid always, let me put in this cheat, get all the money I need, and just build whatever I want to. Now I'm taking it from a very strategic point of view, and have been able to actually grow my cities to a considerable size. And I'm sitting there going, oh, this is how this game works. It's called balance.
And periodically I have to come see how big his city's gotten and how well his budget is balanced and all of that good stuff.
I'm
So awesome.
I'm a little curious how you got that to run on a modern PC. But
I got the games through Good Old Games.
Okay.
And those, when you buy a game through there, they have recoded it in a sense.
Sure.
To play on modern computers. I've been able to, and this is one that, this might be the only reference to it on any kind of media this year, but another series of games that I got back into were the Journeyman Project games, which were point-and-click adventure along the same line of Myst.
Okay.
And those, I haven't played on one of those since I've had a Windows 95 computer. So
Wow, Myst. That's a throwback.
that is a
Well, and so they reshell it because I know that there hasn't been an actual MS-DOS environment included in a Windows package since XP.
No,
and that was released in 2002.
It's put in a DOS box, which is
I'm familiar with DOS box. Yeah.
So,
all right, Caitie.
I've really been into all of the stand-up specials by Eliza on Netflix this week.
Yes, that too. That's the other one.
You're welcome.
Yeah, that's totally. I have to give kudos to Jimmy for that because he knew about her long before I did. But I've been pretty much doing a stand-up special by her a night this week.
Which means by this point you are probably out of them.
No, I still have one more to watch. But she cracks me up. Just her noise effects, and I can't do it. But the little noise, it's like the sheep noise she does when she's talking. Talking about girls. She cracks me up so hard.
As when they heard or
they heard.
I enjoy.
Oh my gosh!
I enjoy her. And it's the ad you'll see on Netflix for it, but. It's when she tries to sound old.
Yes.
Gather around the Snapchat children.
Let me tell you the story of the landline.
So that was what got Caitie into Eliza Schlesinger. I started watching her, it's been years. I was working at the Sundance Plaza Hotel. It's not even called that. It's on University Parkway across from the Joel. I don't know what it's called now. It's some hotel and spa. But I was working night audit shifts there after I finished my Master of Divinity. And one night Netflix recommended Elijah Schlesinger's Freezing Hot. So I was like, ooh, this looks interesting. Hey, this is funny as hell.
Yep. She's in 4, right? There are 4 stand-up specials?
Warpaint, Freezing Hot, whatever. Elder Millennials.
Is the newest one.
And then she did one like 2 or 3 years ago that I can't remember the name of.
That's the one I haven't watched.
Wasn't she on Last Comic Standing or something like that?
She won Last Comic Standing in 2008.
That's where I originally saw her.
And she's, I've watched a couple of YouTube videos of her. She's been on one of the late night hosts whose name I can't remember because it's not Stephen Colbert.
James Corden?
Yes, James Corden. Has been on James Corden a couple times. And
she has her own TV show on, I think, Freeform.
Does she?
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that makes me want to have cable.
You know you can get Freeform shows on Hulu, right?
Okay. Good to know. Good to know.
Just saying. And we do pay for a Hulu subscription so you can watch Grey's Anatomy.
Shush.
So just this week, like earlier this week, I started watching the first season of Altered Carbon on Netflix. And I finished it today. And that series, it's fascinating. You know, there were some really clunky story beats in it, especially toward the end when you had the prototypical, of course, all the 1%ers are going down because they're evil. But one of the things that I really loved about the whole story over 10 episodes was the fact that, yes, this is a dystopian future San Francisco. Yes, the 1%ers have triumphed and the 99% are left to build a slum out of shipping containers on the Golden Gate Bridge. But race does not play a role. Ethnicity does not play a role. Being in a same-sex relationship doesn't play a role. In fact, there was one same-sex relationship that I didn't even really notice until the last episode. And then thinking back, I was like, no, that's been there the whole time. I just didn't notice it because it wasn't remarkable. It just was. People get to be people in this show, even though, you know, it is, like I said, a future where it is a dystopia, where the rich and powerful rule over everything and the poor and downtrodden are down here on Earth. But at the same time, all of our isms are gone. And I love that about the show. And I am so happy Netflix picked it up for a second season. And I really think it's going to be interesting to have Anthony Mackie playing Takeshi Kovacs in the coming season. I'm really interested to see how that plays out. So, yeah.
Along those lines, a show that Molly and I have thoroughly enjoyed has been Westworld. If you have had a chance to see that,
We've watched the first 2 episodes.
We
and that's
started
about as
it.
far as we got.
We don't have an HBO subscription, though. We were using a friend's at the time. So that's part of the reason.
That's fair. I highly recommend. I mean, personally, I highly recommend it because it's an awesome Western sci-fi. But the second season had, without getting into too many spoilers or anything of that nature, really kind of, to me, kind of spoke to what it means to be human, what it means to be machine, what it means to be able to change, and the difference between free will and fate, and also what it kind of even touches on the idea of heaven and hell and what those may be to in the future. Like for us now, it's hell is fire and brimstone, heaven is,
The angels singing on the streets of gold in the crystal sea.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that definitely takes a different take on it and takes it's a show that I'm not even sure I could get into spoilers because I'm still processing it. The finale was probably about a month ago. So, but that's one I would recommend.
Sure.
Yeah.
For philosophical reasons.
I will say we watched the very first episode on election night 2016, so we may still have certain connotations to go along with it.
That's fair.
That we need to cleanse
fair.
the palate and reset. And maybe
I think we
start
all
at
need
the
to
beginning
cleanse the
again.
palate.
What does that say, though, that we were using Westworld as an escape on election night?
Well,
Fun fact.
bourbon just wasn't cutting it, okay?
Fun fact, on election night, I was in Albemarle, lost on back roads because I had been down there for a shoot that we were unable to do. I was afraid to round the corners. I was like, this is it. I think I texted Molly and was like, if I die, I love you. Yeah. So.
Well, we're glad you made it out.
Me too.
Me 3.
So.
On that note, so, dear listeners, there will not be an episode in 2 weeks because after nearly 4.5 years of marriage, Caitie and I are finally going on our honeymoon. Yay! Yes, on August 30th, when you might expect to see an episode, instead we'll be in Costa Rica, so suck it. However, we will be back a week after that with the Reverend Arthur Stewart, the senior minister of Midway Hills Christian Church Disciples of Christ in Dallas, Texas, and the perennial thorn in Pastor Robert Jeffress's flesh. May Arthur ever continue to do that job well. So until then, thank you, Caitie, Jacob, and Molly. It has been fun having you on the show.
Enjoyed it.
You're welcome back anytime because this is the longest discussion we have managed to have since the discussion of the Passion narrative. And we weren't crucifying Christ in this one. So
It was the Jedi.
it was the
Yeah.
Jedi.
Yeah.
So until next time, may the Force be with you. Drink up and read your Bible.
Libations and Lectionaries is recorded and edited using Audacity open source audio editing software. The clip from Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace, and the finale theme from Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back, are used under fair use guidelines, as we spent about a third of this podcast talking about Star Wars, and those clips are used as a reference to the movies. Thanks for listening. Tune in again in 3 weeks when we'll be joined by Reverend Arthur Stewart.